Good morning and welcome to the sixth ILC Future of Ageing conference, broadcasting this year from the ILC Towers, just opposite Parliament on the South Bank. I'd like to add to Sally's thanks and emphasise mention our sponsors, EY, Sanofi, Phoenix, Legal & General and United for All Ages. Really grateful for their support, without which we wouldn't have been able to make today happen. I've got a few sort of bits of housekeeping before we start. You may well have explored the platform already. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there is a session chat, a Q&A section, a poll, and a personal notes tab. You can use this throughout the session, and you'll have the option to email your notes to yourself afterwards. On the upper left-hand side of the screen, you have access to your profile notifications and one-on-one chats, so you can have some one-on-one video chats or messaging with other delegates through the platform. I'd encourage you to use Chrome if you're going to do that, as certainly the video seems to work better with that. If you want to take a break from the conference, we've got the networking room, which is available all the day, and there should be some ILC staff and others in there. If you've got any questions, there is an ILC reception you can find on the home screen, and again on the menu side under Ask the Organisers. And of course, we'd love you to stay afterwards for a bit more of an informal chat, where we'll have 4 different networking rooms you can jump in and out of. Of course, during COVID-19, we've seen the same old young versus old debates reignite, whether it be about older people stealing younger people's jobs or younger super spreaders killing their grannies. The reality is the work that we've done over the last year into our global longevity dividend report, for example, showed that it's not a health versus wealth argument, that actually we need to protect the health of all generations to ensure the wealth of all generations. But actually, whilst we've seen this young versus old debate exposed, at the same time, the joint experience of lockdown has brought together many generations and actually helped people reconnect through new ways. So what we're going to do in this first session is explore where we are with intergenerational relations today, where we need to get to, how do we tackle the big societal questions, whether they be climate change or pandemic recovery, and how do we do this in the context of longevity and an aging society, and how do we create a world that works for all ages. At this point, I'm going to launch a couple of polls. So there are 2 polls that will be launched and will appear. So go and have a look and put your answers in there. I'm going to ask our speakers to do an introduction, and then we'll come back to the poll results afterwards. Today we have Will Moy joining us from Full Fact. We have Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner, and we have Stephen Burke. Unfortunately, Kat Smith is no longer able to join us today, but we should have really good debate with a group of real experts. So let me first introduce Will Smith, who's led Full Fact as Chief Exec since their work began in 2008, served on advisory groups from ESRC, Ofcom, Pew and the Treasury, and regularly gives evidence to select committees. Will, let me pass over to you to kick us off this morning.
Third attempt at that. Thank you very much. Quick fact check, my name is Will Moy. I'm Chief Executive of Full Fact. Full Fact is a charity that fights bad information. We look at the harm it does and how it is caused and what we can do about it. In a world with more information than ever, it's become harder than ever for us to know what to trust. And people who choose to misuse information have rather an easy time of it, whether for personal or political or financial gain. It's become crucial that we find ways of understanding where our information comes from, how we can be misinformed, and the damage that can do. Bad information can ruin lives. It damages people's health, as we've seen vividly this year. It promotes hate, and it hurts democracy. Perhaps most striking of those to me in the 10 years I've been involved in Full Fact has been how clearly bad information has become linked to hate, particularly online. The moment that the Notre Dame Cathedral started burning, very shortly after, within hours, possibly minutes, we saw people deliberately creating images that seemed to be of Muslims laughing in front of the fire. An old hate given a new venue. When the pandemic started earlier this year, we saw claims online that Jewish people had access to a vaccine that they wouldn't share. An old hate given a new venue. It seems to me that better understanding has become crucial in so many areas, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk about it in the context of understanding between generations. So I'd like to ask you some questions, and this is not part of the conference's official polling, and as I ask you the questions, I think you'll be grateful for that. My first question is, how many times do you think that the average young man, somebody aged 18 to 29, has had sex in the past 4 weeks? I will leave you to ponder that. This is part of a set of polling done by Ipsos Mori called Perils of Perception. I will warn you that some of the data I'm going to talk about is up to 10 years old. I wanted to bring data that was really relevant to these questions. It's not all bang up to date, but I think the broad trends will still hold. Ipsos wanted to understand the difference between how the world is and how people think the world is. And they asked a series of factual questions to try to get to this. Here's one. How old do you think the population is in general? How many people do you think are under 18, over 65, and so on? The average estimate in the public is that 36% of the population are over 65. The actual answer is that only 16% of the population is over 65. The consequences of this are hard to predict because, for example, when you ask people, do you think we spend more on job seekers allowance, as it was, or on pensions? 29% of people thought that we spent more on job seekers allowance than we do on pensions. In fact, as a country, we spend 15 times more on pensions than on job seekers allowance. And by the way, the average guess for the number of times an average young man has had sex in the past 4 weeks is 14 times. The reality is about 4 times. And there's a similar mismatch when people are asked about women. What's striking to me about all of these factual misperceptions is that they're remarkably widely shared across the different generations. All of us have surprisingly inaccurate views of the world we're in to start with. And I think that's something that's really worth remembering. Even before we start misunderstanding one another, we're often starting from a misunderstanding of the world we live in. And we have to think about being curious about our own mistakes, our own misunderstandings, and our own assumptions before we can move on to truly understanding others. I don't think that's something that's always easy to do in a world of ever more increasingly opinionated news and comment and ever more fast-moving information environment. So we talked a little bit about what we believe about what the world is. Let's talk about what we believe about how the world is. Ipsos Mori again did a study analysing different generations' attitudes through something called the British Social Attitudes Survey. This is a premier survey of public views, which has been running for decades. And because it's been running for so long, they were able to look at how different generations answered the same questions over time. So you can compare, for example, the pre-war generation, people who are over 66 in 2010, from Generation X and Generation Y and the baby boomers. Generation Y in this case being people who are under 31 in 2010. I want to just bring out a few of the places where there is agreement and a few of the places where there is difference that might be interesting. Given the question, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the way the National Health Service works these days? Generally, we have a high level of satisfaction in the NHS. As somebody once said, it's the closest thing we have to a national religion. Now, this is pre-pandemic, I hasten to stress. But what's really striking about that is that the pre-war generation has 10-point higher satisfaction with the NHS than every other generation, not in any one year, but consistently over time. So roughly 70% plus people would say they're satisfied with how the NHS works in other generations, but roughly 80% plus would say they're satisfied in the pre-war generation. A shift in attitudes to public services can be a profoundly important backdrop to any conversation between generations. Here's a different difference where the youngest generation stands out. Would you tell me if you generally trust the man or woman in the street to tell the truth or not? Generation Y is significantly lower than the other generations. Roughly 60% of people in the pre-war baby boomer and Generation X would generally trust the man or woman in the street to tell the truth. But in Generation Y, it's roughly 40%, significantly lower general levels of social trust. And then finally, one more change in attitudes. Do you think of yourself as a supporter of any one political party? In this case, it's not that one generation stands out. There is a decline over time for the whole population and how much we're likely to associate ourselves with one political party. But what's really striking is that each generation is less likely than the last to support one political party. So the pre-war generation, more than half of people would say they will count themselves as a supporter of a particular political party. Whereas in Generation Y, that number has fallen to 10 to 20%. And again, because these surveys have run so long, we're able to see these not just as effects of where you are in your stage of life, but actually as continuing trends through the course of people's lives. And that's really important. When we talk about our different generations interacting, we are talking about people with very fundamentally different attitudes in some important areas. And finally, I just want to point out one other important difference. We get our information from different places now. And if you look across the whole population at the sources of information that are growing, they are the sources that provide personalized experiences that are different, often for every different user. Things like social media, things like Netflix and other video on demand services. The things that are falling are the ones that provide shared experiences, television, radio, newspapers. Actually, in the latest surveys, and this is up-to-date data from a month or two ago, people who are 65 or over watch watch 204 hours of television news in the past year. People who are 16 to 24 watch only 16 hours of television news. Their information consumption has shifted massively online. That's true across the population, but the younger generation gets its information in a much more personalized, much more fragmented, much less shared experience than the older generation or than we are used to for the whole population. All of this, these differences in how we see the world, we're just all misinformed to start with. We need to make an effort to understand each other. We have different attitudes and we're not necessarily as aware of where those differences in attitudes exist as we could be. We need to work to understand each other. And we are getting our information from different places. We are becoming more fragmented in how we learn about the world. And that is a challenge to building that understanding. So those are some observations to kick us off.
Great, thank you so much, Will. It's really, really helpful and brilliant start to the day. We're going to come back to you when we jump to some questions in a moment. I'd now like to introduce Sophie Howe, who is the world's first Future Generations Commissioner, her role being to safeguard the interest and well-being of future generations in Wales. Sophie was previously the youngest councillor in Wales, having been elected at the age of 21. I should say we've got a very, very strong relationship with Wales and the Welsh Government at ILC. I grew up myself in Wales, as some of you will know, and I could sing the Vitalite advert in Welsh. That's my last memory of my Welsh GCSE that I have left, but I won't do that. We did, of course, have Helena Herclots, the Welsh Commissioner, last year. Sophie, give us your perspective. It's such an exciting job you've got and so important. Tell us what you think.
Well, thanks, Bore da, as we say in Wales. Good morning. It's great to be with you. I mean, I think, in Wales we have We're the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations through our groundbreaking Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which was passed in our Senedd in 2015. And so, sorry, excuse me. Put simply, that act, well, it does a number of things, but I suppose the overarching principle is that it requires all 44 of our main public bodies, so our local authorities, our health boards and so on, and significantly the Welsh Government itself, to demonstrate how they're taking decisions in a way which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it then sets out 7 national wellbeing goals, which were devised in conversation with the people of Wales. We had held a national conversation asking them, what is the Wales that you want to leave behind to your children and your grandchildren? And at the time, we were also, our legislation was in development at the same time as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we took learning from that as well. So we have 7 national wellbeing goals, which take us towards a kind of progressive Wales that we want in 2050. And the Act then also sets out 5 ways of working, which, you know, the minister who took the legislation through described the Act as the Common Sense Act, because these particular principles were seen as kind of common sense. So planning for the long term, or recognising the long term impact of the decisions that we take, preventing problems from occurring or getting worse, integrating our thinking, so recognising the connections between all of these different goals and policy areas, collaborating amongst the public sector and beyond the public and private and third sector, and then involving citizens. So, you know, Common Sense Act, because all of those things you would think would be key tenets of kind of public policy and decision making in any case. But I think, as we've seen, common sense, unfortunately, isn't always that common. And then, you know, it sets out a Future Generations Commissioner, my role to oversee the implementation of the legislation. So again, coming back to that kind of perspective on common sense, there's nothing in the legislation that isn't entirely reasonable, and I would say that most people would think isn't already happening in public policy spheres. So why is it that we need a piece of law to require people to demonstrate how they are taking account of the needs of future generations? Well, we only have to look at the fact that we've got, what, 10, 11 years, if you listen to sort of 97% of climate scientists, to save the planet. And I think it's quite interesting in terms of some of the points that Will was making, you know, in terms of our misinformation and our different perceptions. But I suppose in some of these elements, I would question, you know, are we misinformed, or are we just reluctant to act? And in the case of climate change, you know, we have known about the climate catastrophe coming our way for a significant period of time, and we have not acted on that. A friend of mine, as a girl from a former council estate, I never thought I'd heard myself utter the words "a friend of mine who's a philosopher," but a friend of mine who's a philosopher, Roman Knarek, has written a book called The Good Ancestor, and in that he talks about how we tend to almost colonize future generations. So we view them, we view the future as some sort of distant colony where we can just send all of our waste, our rubbish, our problems to, because someone else, you know, it's someone else's problem. And I think to a certain extent, that is certainly something which has happened in terms of the climate emergency, in terms of the way perhaps that we run our economy. So this insatiable quest for growth at any cost. So we can see that, you know, the rich get richer, the poor often getting poorer. We can see the damage that we've done to the planet, and so on. And I don't think we can claim that we didn't know about these things. In fact, we've put more carbon into the atmosphere since Al Gore published his first Inconvenient Truth than any other time in our history. And so we've done that knowingly. So hence why it is so important to have these legal duties requiring people to consider how we balance the interests of future generations and current generations. But I'm often asked, so doesn't that mean, you know, some really difficult decisions then? Doesn't that mean that, you know, we should stop spending so much on pensions and actually, you know, start shifting that money towards tackling child poverty? Doesn't that mean that, you know, if you're thinking about the COVID crisis, you know, a real prime example there of that kind of intergenerational conflict, younger people potentially, having some of their freedoms removed, largely to protect the older generation. But I think that that's an unhelpful way of looking at it, because as a starting point, we should be looking at the things to do in terms of policy which actually benefit both generations, or benefit generations across the spectrum. So if we're thinking about long-term sustainability, things like, and I've recommended this to the government, that we should focus on a national wellness system, because when we see the NHS at the moment, and obviously we're seeing it at a time of crisis, but is this a kind of dress rehearsal for what's to come? Because we've essentially invested in a national illness service. We park our ambulance at the bottom of a cliff and wait for people to fall off, and then we treat them. We do exactly the same in terms of not intervening early in childhood adversities and so on. We haven't done the hard yards in terms of helping middle-aged populations, and indeed younger populations, to develop healthy behaviours and to support their health and well-being in a way which should mean that when they become the older generation, they're doing, as Mr. Spock said, living long and prospering, rather than living long in ill health and so on. So how do we invest now in current generations to ensure that when those current generations become older, that they are living long and fulfilled and healthy lives? How do we think about the way in which we construct our communities and how we connect our communities? Investing in public transport has multiple wins. It's really good for the older generations, and that's why we're seeing things across the UK like free bus passes. But actually, if we can get to a position where young people don't feel that they have to use a car, that they do have accessible and affordable public transport options, that's really good for both generations. So taking away our investment from roads and into public transport is a sensible solution for both generations. Thinking about things like 20-minute neighbourhoods, how we connect and build cohesive communities, that's good for younger generations. It's good to support the foundational economy in those areas. That's a far more sustainable approach. It's also good for older generations who may be able to access services, infrastructure and so on, or should be able to access those within 20 minutes of their home. And then when we think about education and lifelong learning, all of the international evidence suggests that lifelong learning will have to become the new norm. We are in the middle of a kind of fourth industrial revolution, a digital revolution, and things are changing at a pace that we've never seen before. So people will have to be constantly upskilling, reskilling, learning new things. And yet we've decimated our approach to lifelong learning, which is why it's much more difficult for someone over the age of 55 to re-enter into the labour market if they're made unemployed or lose their job than it is for the younger generation. In Wales, we have a new schools curriculum, which is brilliant, really aspirational, very much focuses around the health and well-being of young people, helping to make them ethical and informed global citizens, focusing on creativity and entrepreneurship. But actually, there's no way that our current teaching profession is going to be able to deliver that without support of others. And again, one of my proposals is a national mission on education, where you bring together different skills into the education system, including the skills of older people, to help deliver that curriculum. So why wouldn't we have people who have experience of living in the 1930s delivering the curriculum for history? Why wouldn't we have people who've set up a business being part of the teaching workforce in terms of entrepreneurship and so on? And so I think that the way to look at this is not to pitch one generation against the next. It's undeniable that younger people in particular are facing some significant challenges with Brexit, with COVID and the long ongoing results that we will see from that. But it's also undeniable that there are some significant challenges facing older people. And the way to solve this is not by setting people apart, it's by bringing them together.
Great, thanks, Sophie. That's really, really good. I think really strong message that what tends to be good for older generations also tends to be good for younger and vice versa. I think your messages around lifelong learning extraordinarily important. We're today launching a new program of work with IRC for HR around the importance of work and lifelong learning. We'll be looking for a set of innovations to support people to continue to workplaces to adapt to an aging world. And of course, lifelong learning is an extraordinarily important part of that. Of course, you mentioned Roman, who's published his book, and we have him speaking in the last session. So I hope you'll all stay on to listen to him. Let me now pass on to Stephen. Stephen's got 30 years experience in leadership in the third and public sector, was the CEO of Counsel and Care and the Daycare Trust, and set up United for All Ages 10 years ago. And I should say, Stephen had about 10 minutes notice that he was going to jump into this session, but so I'm very grateful for Stephen, and I'm sure he'll do a brilliant job. Stephen.
Thank you very much, David. And I really quickly want to reflect on some of what Sophie and Will have said. And I apologise that I'm not Kat's fifth, and she would have done a brilliant job talking about the impact, particularly on younger people, but hopefully we'll hear from her at some point in the future. I think the point I would like to follow on from both David ended on and Sophie ended on is the interconnection, the fact that things that affect older people also affect younger people. My favourite example is around housing, and the fact that the lack of housing options for older people means that fewer homes are released by older people for younger people, and we need to improve housing options for older people. So just quickly, in terms of what COVID has meant in terms of intergenerational fairness and connection. I mean, I think first of all, everyone knows that COVID has exacerbated existing inequalities, but I think it's also highlighted quite usefully some of those inequalities, and has actually prompted government action in areas where we might not have seen any action without COVID. So around free school meals is an obvious example. But also around universal credit and people's awareness of universal credit. But it is also, there are lots of things that haven't happened. And Sophie highlighted the issue, for instance, about health and looking at long-term prevention and health promotion. And we need to do much more of that. And again, also around lifelong learning. The second issue is obviously COVID has prompted a lot more mutual aid and support between generations, particularly at a local level. And that's been really important. It's also highlighted our dependence on public services, and I think that needs to be reflected going forward in terms of investment in those public services. And I think the main focus has been on the way we live now and the way we're going to be living in the future, particularly in our local communities. It's certainly changing the way we work, it's changing the way we live in terms of our homes, and it's changing the way we travel. And all of us are going to be living much closer and working much closer to home. And the point that Sophie raised about 20-minute neighbourhoods is really important. That where we live is going to, and we're going to want to contribute much more to where we live. The obvious impacts on young people have been around jobs and job security and income, and obviously for older people, particularly around health. But I think the common thing that has affected people of all generations has been around social isolation and loneliness, and the impact on mental health. And I think we're going to be paying for that for a long time to come, and we need to ensure that that is addressed going forward. The three things which I would particularly pick up just going forward. First of all, despite the fact that a lot of us have had contact with different generations within our own families, I actually think COVID has exacerbated age segregation in our society, that people have probably had less contact as a result of COVID with people from other generations. And it's that lack of contact, that lack of connection and lack of communication with people of other generations, which actually leads to a lot of the things that Will talked about in terms of people's perceptions and prejudices about other people and about ageism in general. So we need to bring people together, and you know, hopefully in our discussion we can talk about ways in which we can bring people together. The second thing I think COVID has highlighted in terms of tackling intergenerational fairness, it's the need to address a few longer term issues. Housing, I'm afraid, has been neglected, and the most recent spending review announcement hardly touched on housing. We need to invest in much more affordable housing, 300,000 new homes a year at least, to tackle the housing crisis in this country. But we also need to look at much fairer taxation, and we need to look at how we tax wealth in particular, because COVID again has highlighted the wealth divide in our country. And then the third thing, and this is kind of really playing to what Sophie's been talking about, is that we need to ensure that all policies, when they're being drawn up and considered, and existing policies as well, we look at the intergenerational impact of those policies and really assess how they're affecting older people, younger people, and future generations. And that's probably the key point for us. If we're going to change our society, then we need to look at how every policy impacts on every generation. Thank you, David.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Really good, really useful. And as I say, you didn't disappoint despite your very short notice you had. So thank you, Stephen. Can we perhaps bring up the poll results now? Is that possible? So they'll just come up now for us. The first one should appear on your screen now. Yeah, so we see actually the majority of us here in the audience are Generation X. We've got a few boomers, we've got some millennials, and not many Gen Zs. Oh, a few more Gen Xs there jumping in. On to perhaps the next question. So half of you here think that COVID has exacerbated intergenerational conflict, whereas 25% think alleviated and 20% had no effect. So I think there's generally a view that COVID has not been helpful by the majority of you here who are joining us today. Let's perhaps have with that in the back of our mind, and we'll perhaps come back to that later. Just a few questions, and there are some questions. There is. I remind you that you can put your questions up in the Q&A, and I'll run through some of those. We've had a few questions. We had a couple of questions about social media so far, and perhaps the first one maybe sort of targeted at Will initially. So, you know, I have a 13-year-old boy who pretty much since he was born has been told to be careful online. There are real challenges of keeping young people safe online. But actually, there was a story about 2 years ago now that talked about how older people were more likely than younger to share fake news on Facebook. I just wonder, Will, if you've got thoughts on, you know, actually, undoubtedly, the online environment is difficult for all of us. How are there ways that we can help all generations be a bit more savvy in terms of the what we believe and listen to and share?
Thanks, that's a great question, and I'm very grateful to you for making that crucial point, which is everybody is vulnerable to being misinformed. Everybody can just glance at something and know whether it's true or not, whether you do fact checking for a living or whatever you do. So we all need to be careful when we're reading the news, as we all well know, or whether we're looking at things online. And there is an effect that we do seem to see in the research, that children who have grown up with the internet, who are digital natives, sometimes recognize when things don't look right or are able to pick up cues that people who haven't grown up in those environments find less obvious. So there is a reason why it might be that younger people are sometimes better equipped to spot things that aren't right. And there are also good reasons why older people might be better equipped to spot some other things that aren't right, have a broader range of experience and context to draw on. So we ask everybody to ask themselves 3 questions. Firstly, where's it from? Do you know the source? Can you trace it back to an original source? Do you have any reason to trust that source? Secondly, what's missing? Don't just look at the headline, click through and see the rest of the story. Maybe do a search and see if there's any wider context out there. And thirdly, and most importantly, how do you feel? The characteristic of information that is designed to deceive or that is dangerously misleading, even when it's well-intentioned, is often that it gets you riled up, that it makes you worried, that it makes you angry, that it makes you concerned. And that's the point at which we're all vulnerable to a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. So if you see something that's pushing your buttons, you're not sure where it's from, you don't know the full context, pause, take a moment, and stop before you share. Because the wonderful thing about online information is that we all have the power to do something to help our friends and family be better informed. And very often that's just stopping before you share.
That's great, really, really helpful. Thanks, Will. Sophie, you talked about lifelong learning. Do you think there's sort of, a role for that in terms of ensuring that, as we do, and I think Will made the point that different generations are consuming media in different sorts of ways. Is there a way that we can ensure and invest in lifelong learning so that all generations can, are less susceptible to risk online and can maximise the potential of the online engagement as well?
Absolutely, and there's some brilliant programmes happening across Wales where we're looking at the sort of multiple wins between pairing younger generations and older generations around learning digital skills. And one programme in particular, which I just absolutely love, is a programme where schools, a school is regularly going to a care home, teaching digital skills and a range of other things. But what's really interesting about that is that the school have targeted those kids who had poor attendance, probably have issues going on at home. If you follow any of the evidence around adverse childhood experiences, in Wales, about 14% of people have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and that means when they grow up, they're 20 times more likely to end up in prison and 7 times more likely to have a teenage pregnancy, 6 or 7, I think it is, and so on and so on. And the evidence around that suggests that the mitigating factors or the protective factors relate to the sort of presence of an always available adult. So what this school have done is paired these kids with adults in the care home to teach digital skills. And what's been really interesting is that the school has reported improved behaviour and improved attendance amongst these kids. And the care home have reported a significant reduction in the use of antipsychotic medication since this programme has been in place. And so, this is the thing that I think we need to do. We need to find innovative solutions to solve, multi-generational problems. And it's not rocket science in a way. It just requires a bit of, clever thinking about how we bring these things together, and also how we shift the way that we do public spending and that we deliver public services towards some of these more innovative solutions, rather than just thinking an approach to social care is for Meals on Wheels once a day or whatever it might be, but to be thinking more broadly, how can we do multiple things in solving, how can we solve a number of problems at once?
Great, thank you very much, Sophie. And I think there are some really interesting initiatives like the one you mentioned. Now, BT have been doing some interesting intergenerational digital initiatives as well. And I remember when I was at Help the Aged, we had a volunteering program for care homes where, when we went out and said to people of all ages, do you want to go and volunteer in care homes? People said, why? What would I say to them? When we said to people, well, actually, why don't you go into this care home and share your skills, use the internet? Actually, we were inundated with people where we actually managed to find, areas where the older people themselves in the care homes wanted to give back to the community and vice versa. It really, really worked. Let me perhaps just move on to sort of a question we've got, I think from Alistair McQueen, around the extent to which you know, the pandemic, the health challenges we've got, the global health challenges we've got, have made it more difficult for governments to, or less, to plan for the long term. So what we know is that, you know, actually in the UK and Northern Europe, we've been aging over about 300 years. We've been aging very slowly, and arguably this is one of the reasons why we haven't done very much about it. And Sophie also mentioned climate change, clearly another example of where actually it can always wait till tomorrow has been the argument for real action. I suppose the question, let me just come back to you, Sophie, and then I'll go to Stephen, is, you know, actually, do you think the pandemic has actually made it more difficult because of this urgent need to protect, the acute need to protect the most vulnerable, more difficult to plan for the long term? Or will it be such a shock to the system, you know, in places like Wales, to the politicians, to the media, where they're saying, you know what, actually we've got to deliver this national wellness service, we've got to deliver a health service that prevents ill health? Which way do are you on the optimistic side, or the, you know, actually we're still going to be talking about the challenges of longevity and climate change in 10 years' time?
So I'm always a glass half full person. So and I'm, you know, I think there's lots to be optimistic about in terms of what I'm seeing in the change in policy direction in Wales. So I've been in post almost 5 years, and I've spent those 5 years challenging a system of old to try and get that system to do new and better things. And that's been, you know, trying to change the habits of, you know, many lifetimes around short-termism, around, you know, an obsession with the use of the car rather than invest in public transport, you know, and I could go on and on. What I've seen as a result of the pandemic, particularly, I've been, you know, very involved with the government in terms of discussions on the reconstruction strategy post-COVID. And what we are seeing is things like economic investment going into improving the quality of homes. Now, that's really interesting because it's one of those areas that, as I describe, have multiple wins, multiple benefits, because you can create jobs in that way and, you know, stimulate local economies. You can, you know, by doing that, you're reducing your carbon emissions that are coming from homes. You're taking people out of fuel poverty. You're potentially keeping people, particularly older people, out of hospital in the winter, because, you know, stopping them going in, you know, through, you know, illnesses that have come from poor quality housing and so on. And then I'm also seeing, you know, significant reinvestments in public transport. I'm seeing a focus on the foundational economy and so on and so on. So I think there's lots to be optimistic about. I think there are going to be some significant challenges in terms of the National Health Service. There are things that have happened in the NHS which I think we need to really find some time and space and capacity to focus on. How do we keep them, and how do we not just tweak the system to be doing the same old thing? So, you know, in Wales, over that sort of 6 to 8 week period at the beginning of, you know, April, the beginning of the pandemic, the NHS shifted online, went digital, probably at a speed, you know, during that sort of 8 week period. It probably would have taken them more than 8 years in normal circumstances to actually do that. Now, there are some challenges with that, obviously, because we need that support for older people in particular, who are not digital natives, who are not, you know, don't necessarily have those skills. But what I think is quite interesting about that is that it gives opportunities for the health system to run more efficiently. So it's now, you know, much easier to kind of have your 10-minute Zoom consultation or what have you with your clinician, and presumably that clinician can get through more of those Zoom consultations in a day. Now, my proposition around that is, what we shouldn't be doing is just delivering the same service but delivering it online. What we should be doing is using those efficiencies to say, I'm a clinician who's not just going to look at the immediate condition in front of me, but I'm actually going to think about your life conditions, because we know that the wider determinants of health, the social determinants of health, whether you're living in poverty, whether you live in good quality housing, whether you're living in areas of high air pollution, you know, what's your social infrastructure, all of those things are really crucial, more crucial actually to people's long-term health and well-being. So where I see that there is this shift towards a national wellness system is in those areas where the government are investing. That's all part of a national wellness system. But I also think we need our NHS to be using this opportunity, and this is difficult when they're, you know, really under the cosh in terms of the pandemic, but using this opportunity to say we're going to retain the good things that have come out of it and use that as an opportunity to do different things.
That's great, Sophie. Really, really good. We've of course been doing at ILC been doing some work with G20 ministers over the last couple of years, and what's really clear now is that there, at the global level, there is a real agreement actually across the world that it is important that we prevent ill health, and over the next year we're going to be moving on from, you know, convincing politicians that we need to do it to working out how we do it. And I think that's where we are now. We all agree that we need to do this. The question is how we move you know, organizations like the NHS. Stephen, what do you think? You are, you know, as a, are you a former? Would you describe yourself a former politician? You know, are we still going to be here in 10 years talking about the same thing, or are our political elites going to have grasped the nettle of some of these big long-term issues?
Well, these are eternal issues, aren't they? I'm afraid, but never say never. I think this is a real opportunity, and for us to take a fresh start, or a reset, as people say, and actually think long term about our society, and really think strategically about where we're heading as a society. So, you know, if politicians are prepared to do that and think beyond the short term, then we could see some big change. And I think prevention would be a really good focus, whether it's around health or around climate change and all sorts of other aspects of our society, if we focus on prevention. But what I think we need to do is convince ourselves and convince the Treasury and others of the cost benefits of such an approach. Because I think, unfortunately, people like the Treasury still don't believe it's worth investing in things like you know, better care, as well as health promotion and things like that. So let's think long term. Let's think future generations, as Sophie has suggested.
Great. Great, thanks very much. I think a final question from the audience for now, and then I'll ask everyone to have 30 seconds at the end. A couple of you in your introductions talked about sort of the role of work across the life course. Any thoughts, Sophie, perhaps about how we make the most of the talents of all generations in terms of both work and volunteering? Are there? I know there were some brilliant companies out there. We did some work earlier this year on the case for a midlife MOT, which is a sort of an initiative led by employers to try and support people to make you know, health and well-being and work decisions in midlife. Have you got, you know, are there things going on in Wales? Could we be doing more along the work agenda?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are some brilliant projects in terms of intergenerational learning, as I mentioned, but one of the things that I've just published, is a duty of the Commissioner to publish something called Future Generations Report once every 5 years, and this gives advice to the government and others in public bodies in Wales of the things that they should be doing going forward. And one of the things that I've suggested is a programme which I'm really interested in, which is with employers. So at the point that people are sort of reaching retirement, that employers look at something akin to a kind of secondment arrangement into a voluntary sector organisation. And the idea with that is that it's part of the transition to retirement, and there's some, I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but there are some really interesting figures around that in terms of how many older people then who go into retirement continue with the volunteering that was started as part of that secondment arrangement. That comes with a package of support around, helping them to think about broader life choices and so on during retirement. But I think that there's, what we want to do is to find ways that older people's skills, don't just stop at the point that they retire, that actually those skills are reinvested in community and socially, activities with a kind of social purpose. And I think, we all say that that's good, but I'm not sure that there's actually that much of a focus from employers on how that can happen. And one of the purposes of the Future Generations Act is to get our organisations in Wales to be thinking right across their remit. So this isn't just about what they deliver as public services. This is also about how they spend their money, how they do their procurement, how they think about their workforce planning and what they do with their workforce, and how, in perhaps taking a different approach like that, like supporting time off for volunteering, like doing a range of other things, they can actually be driving through their workforce a much larger social benefit. And I think that there is a huge number of older people who could be part of that movement, and imagine the difference that could be made if there was a national approach towards making that happen.
Great, thanks so much, Sophie. Sorry, I had a slight issue with my computer, as is inevitable, that something was going to go wrong. Thank you very much for your help. We've got 2 minutes. I'm going to ask everyone perhaps to come in with some reflections for the last 30 seconds each, and I'm going to kick off with Stephen, then we'll then go back to Sophie. So Stephen.
Very quickly, David, we need to look at how we bring different generations together to tackle some of those issues around perceptions and make sure people are actually talking together and addressing common issues and common concerns. And we need to tackle some of the big issues around fairness in our society, around housing, which we'll discuss later today, around taxation, and around wealth.
Great, thank you very much. Will?
I'm sorry to say that I'm much less optimistic than Sophie was about tackling these big issues. The government is currently dealing with 3 simultaneous crises: a massive challenging recession, the global pandemic, and the huge disruption that will be caused by Brexit. On top of that, we have the NHS dealing with really significant change. People are living longer, they are ill for longer in their lives, our treatments are getting more expensive. We don't have a way through that. And on top of that, successive governments have demonstrated that they bury their heads in the sand and refuse to acknowledge tectonic political issues like social care. I think there is a lot to do to challenge our political leaders to step up to the plate when it would be difficult for them anyway because of the hugely demanding situation that they are currently in.
Thanks, Will. And Sophie, last comments from you?
Yeah, I think Will raises some really valid points. I think our perception in Wales perhaps is slightly different. So I suppose my call would be for, shouldn't we have a common sense act for the whole of the UK? If you can get behind the act that Lord John Bird with Caroline Lucas are taking forward in Parliament, I think that would be absolutely brilliant. I think that helps us to provide a framework for challenging politicians on that, short-term thinking. It helps to provide a framework to think about actions in an integrated way, and it helps to provide a framework for us to find the things that unite us between the generations, not the things that set us apart.
Great, thank you very much. And I love the idea. I think we should definitely all be pushing for a common sense act across the UK and indeed across the world. Maybe that's what we need to be pushing to our G20 ministers as well. Thank you so much all for joining us in this first session. It's been really, really good. Apologies for all of a sudden black screen that happened. The conference is going to continue. Please do make the most of the networking functions. I'm going to be joining you a little bit later on, and if you play your cards right, I might well sing the Vitalite advert in Welsh during our networking session at the end. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Sophie, Stephen, and Will for joining us.
Thank you.